Hello and welcome. You are with Argumentative Indians, and I am Bhuvan Apurva Jha. Tibet remains a key factor in Indo-China relations. After the Chinese occupation of Tibet in 1950, India and China came to share the now disputed common border. In recent years, with China's extensive military buildup and massive environmental exploitation of Tibet, as well as reported intentions to divert or dam rivers that arise in Tibet but flow into India, Indian anxieties have only worsened. On the other hand, the Chinese approach is largely driven by its insecurity surrounding the presence of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, and around a lakh-strong community of Tibetans in exile in India. The government of India's official stance that the Dalai Lama is an honored guest and a respected religious leader with a large following in India, and that the Dalai Lama is accorded all due courtesies and freedom to conduct religious and spiritual activities in India, have so far failed to assuage Chinese concerns. The hardened Chinese stance is evidenced by the fact that even a mere public acknowledgement of the apex Tibetan religious and spiritual leader by any section of the Indian administration is construed as infringement on Chinese sovereignty. Conversely, India too has now adopted a more hardened stance owing to China's aggressive territorial claims on India, the deepening of the China-Pakistan friendship, and a shift in China's position vis-a-vis the Indian Union territory of Jammu and Kashmir. Amidst all of this, ladies and gentlemen, are the Tibetans in exile in India, largely ignored by the world's press, but the thorn no less in China's eyes. In the face of insurmountable odds, this small community has managed to preserve and protect most of their 1300-year-old Buddhist traditions, culture, and identity. However, opportunities in India have been limited, and a recent trend of Tibetans moving to other nations has been reported. It also does not help that India is not a signatory to the 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugees, which would ensure legal protection of the rights of the Tibetans. Consequently, the Tibetans in India have minimal access to social welfare schemes and are ineligible for government jobs. If this rapid emigration continues, what will remain of the Tibetan community in India, the country which the Dalai Lama made his home? On the other hand, the Chinese policy of one nation, one party, one language, one culture has been entirely dismissive of the Tibetan identity. China has also been attempting to interfere in choosing the successor of Dalai Lama with their pro-China candidate. To counter this, the United States passed a legislation in 2020, allowing Tibetans to choose the successor of the Dalai Lama without any external influence. India, on the other hand, has been deeply respectful of the historical linkages with Tibet. Over the ages, many gurus and spiritual leaders from India sought refuge in Tibet due to a host of reasons. Fast forward to the 21st century, and India now is the safe haven for Tibetans. However, with no end in sight, the question remains: has the global leadership lost its moral compass in the face of naked Chinese might, or is there some hope left for the Tibetans in exile? Ladies and gentlemen, we are discussing the topic, is the Tibet movement a lost cause, with an eminent panel on Argumentative Indians this evening. Dr. Tenzing Dorji, former commissioner at US Commission on International Religious Freedom. Ambassador Phunchok Stobdan, former Indian ambassador to Kyrgyzstan. Dr. Michael Dillon, professor of history affiliate Lao China Institute, King's College. And Dr. Tsering Tobgyal, assistant professor in international relations, University of Birmingham. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us in what promises to be a most riveting discussion. Dr. Tenzing Dorji, I'd like to begin our discussion this evening with you. From growing up and working in India as a Tibetan in exile for over 30 years to becoming a professor, and then the first Tibetan American commissioner at the USCIRF, what are your observations, Dr. Dorji, when you look at the times gone by? Is there a possibility that the Tibet movement may now slowly be fading into oblivion?
Hello and namaste to all my co-expert panelists and organizers and all Indian brothers and sisters and anybody plugged into this Zoom or webinar. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this expert panel on Is Tibet movement a lost cause? We can look at this question from many perspectives. You know, it would be easy sometimes to say, yes, not much attention is paid to the Tibet cause these days. For example, much of the attention in the United States and around the world is on the Uyghurs, East Turkestan, freedom, human rights. And so therefore, His Holiness the Dalai Lama couldn't travel that much because of advanced age. So therefore, Tibet seems to be, Tibet movement seems to be lost cause. But I grew up in India, and I am most thankful to India, government India, and people of India, like all other Tibetans. And India knows best our story about Tibet in India, Tibet's independent status, Tibet's struggle for their freedom right now. And so talking here to our Indian brothers, sisters is like preaching to the choir. Yeah. But I understand why you raised this question. It's a very timely one. If you just look at Tibet and China by themselves, because of the population and economic power, China is a global economic power, military, and you just name it. And Tibet seems to have no case to fight against China. But if you look from a socio-ecological perspective, the matter is not as simple as that. You know, Tibet and Tibet issue, I don't think it's only about Tibet and Tibetans. It is, we live in a globalized world, and it's very complex issues. Yeah, and I would like to make a case that Tibet, movement is not a lost cause. A bit difficult case to make here, but I'll make some remarks at the beginning, and then we can have more discussions. You know, if we look from the larger perspective, Tibet is the water tower of Asia. The rivers from Tibet feed almost 2 billion peoples. And many experts like Brahmachari, I think in one of the latest books called Asia, and the next century, the defining thing is going to be about water stress and water crisis. And we already have seen that in China, the Yangtze River started to dry up, which is fed by the Tibetan rivers, and China's have developed mega dams, to preserve all the water for themselves. And as to the extent I know that Tibet, China, India and China has no water treaties there. Just correct me if I got it wrong. And so that could affect, over billions of people, downstream countries, and it's a huge deal. So great strategists like Brahmachari worries about that, and many people did. Then there's also a book called Meltdown in Tibet by Michael Berkeley, who is also making a case that because of China's very aggressive operations and repressive policy in Tibet, the water resources are very much restricted, and that is affecting the whole world. And so without water, we can't live it. Everybody talks about before how we go to war for oil or to capture the land, as China did with Tibet, but the next is going to be about water. So therefore, Tibet matters in that sense when we talk about ecological preservations and things like that for the whole world. Then there's the issue of the Dalai Lama's reincarnation. China's calculations that His Holiness is very advanced age. They always think that Tibet and Dalai Lama are the one and the same thing. If His Holiness passes away, the Tibet story ends there, and then they can celebrate even more. They thought that's what it is. But His Holiness has said many times that Tibet issue is not about the Dalai Lama issue. If that's it, then it could have been solved easily. It's just one person and a nation. But Tibet issue, is issue of the 6 million Tibetans. So I, in my meetings with some important people, started to make this case that communist is an atheist country and trying to control the reincarnation like they did with the Panchen Lama, and they are planning to do for the Dalai Lama with all new policies, they make it up. It's not going to work because reincarnation is a religious belief system. And we have this for centuries. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama has said clearly on many occasions that he would like the Tibet and China issue to be resolved through middle way approach and dialogue. If that happens, he will return to Tibet and issue is solved. if China, as it has always been very stubborn and not think that all the cards are on their side, so they think Tibetans no card, they wait, and if the Dalai Lama passes away, I'm pretty sure that His Holiness will be reborn in a free country, and very likely in India. Yeah. And if I had to make a bet, which I shouldn't, because His Holiness can decide where he wants, I have no power to do that. He could be likely be reborn in the Himalaya Buddhist region, you know. So the Tibet issue will continue, and it's not going to be. I think the next Dalai Lama is even going to come with much more brilliant than, which we can imagine. The present Dalai Lama is the greatest of all 14 Dalai Lamas, but the 15th is going to come with even greater power, because he knew the stories and what he has been through. So therefore, if you look at it from a socio-ecological perspective, it's a very complex issue. Even if, let's say, nobody cares about Tibet, because I understand every nation, their first interest has to be your national interest, right? And then you help or you do whatever it is. But that being said, Tibet has been used as a chessboard by many countries, and people love to play chess, it seems. You know, if you look at British India, Tsar Russia, and Communist China, they play the chess game on Tibet. And so where we are end up, largely has to do with that. But there are cases to be made, as you mentioned in your remark, that 2020, United States has passed the Tibet Support and Policy Act. When I was the chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, I did my part to be able to have passed that act. And then 2018, United States passed the Reciprocal Access to Tibet Act, right? And this doesn't matter whichever president sitting in the White House has to follow them. And right now, at the moment, there is an act in the House, and there's a parallel one coming up in the Senate called Promoting Resolution to Sino-Tibetan Conflict Act. So this raises the question about the legitimacy of China's control of Tibet. They said international has to define it. So there's a lot of issues there, and I'll stop my remark there and love to hear other experts and then join the conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Dorji. In fact, when you mention about the Tibetan plateau as the water tower, or the third pole as it is often referred, and coupled with the Chinese policy of environmental extractivism that is in vogue there, we hope to discuss that in the questions to come. But for the time being, I'd like to bring in Dr. Michael Dillon for his opinion on whether the Tibet movement is losing traction globally. You have had a vast experience in when it comes to China and the conflicts therein. How would you see it? How would you read the tea leaves on this one?
Yes, good afternoon to you all, Tashi Dele. I'm not primarily a Tibetan specialist, but I do agree with Tenzin Dorji's comments just now that to a certain extent, because of the problems in Xinjiang, Eastern Turkestan, the issue of Tibet has to a certain extent taken a back seat. I think it's a great pity. I mean, I've done rather more work on Xinjiang than on Tibet, but I did make a point of writing about Tibet in a book I wrote called Lesser Dragons. That I think that brings me to one of the points I wanted to make, that we're looking at Tibet, and I'll say something about the Tibetan movement and the rights and wrongs of China in Tibet specifically in a few minutes. But I think it's impossible to consider the present or future of Tibet seriously without considering the Chinese perspective and what the Chinese can and will do. Our chairman's asked me to present something on the Chinese perspective. I do so, but I do want to make it clear that I'm relating what that perspective is. That doesn't mean that I support that perspective. Well, I think we need to understand what it is. I mean, excuse me, China considers that Tibetans are merely one of 55 separate ethnic minorities, Xiaochuminzu, national minorities. Now, that's pretty insulting in many ways to Tibetans, but I think equally to Uyghurs or Mongols, who all have their own culture, language, literature, different from the Hans. But the Chinese government has tried to create one policy for all of these peoples, which doesn't necessarily properly distinguish between the different needs and the different minorities. Recently, as we've heard, there has been incredible focus on Xinjiang, mainly because of the detention camps that were introduced in 2018 and the horrific conditions that there are there. And I think we can't, that won't go away. That's part of China's policy towards ethnic minorities. And what people might not remember is that the originator of these policies was Chen Quanguo, who, before moving to Xinjiang, was the Communist Party secretary in Tibet. And he'd established some systems of blockhouses and surveillance in Tibet. But when he moved to Xinjiang, they were used there in a much more oppressive way even than in Tibet. And I think it's a fair point to say that we haven't heard a great deal about Tibet recently. Somebody did write in the press suggesting that Tibet would have the same problems as the Uyghurs of Xinjiang have. But Robert Barnett, who you may know of, who's a distinguished Tibetan expert, did make the point that although there was this huge repression in Tibet, it was nothing like as bad as the Uyghurs. But we have to, I apologize, but I have problems with my voice. I will try and be as clear as I can. It's certainly the case that there is continued repression in Tibet. The problems of the self-immolation of monks and nuns, which many of us find quite horrific. The inability of, I mean, the most recent events that I can remember are the destruction of a major monastery complex in the Tibetan area of Sichuan in 2016. So I think that is all part of China's view that these are minority groups which must conform to a single homogeneous Chinese model. One more thing I want to say about that is that things change in China. Xi Jinping has only been in power since 2012, 2013. In theory, his term of office should be finishing next month. In all probability, it won't finish next month. He will continue in some way. We don't know. October sees the next Communist Party National Congress. It is assumed that he will continue as General Secretary. But at some point he will leave. And if you look at the historical pattern of Chinese control over the whole of China as it is today, including Tibet, Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, then you see a zigzag between relatively liberal and relatively authoritarian. And I think the chances are that once Xi Jinping goes, China will revert to a less authoritarian model. I can't be certain, nobody can be certain, that is my guess. One final thing I'd like to say in this introductory comment is looking at Tibet in the same way that I look at Xinjiang, I feel I have to distinguish between two things. One is what should happen in terms of morality, justice, and human rights, and what in reality is possible given the political nature of Chinese control over its own country and influence in neighboring countries. And I think we have to distinguish between the two. And I'm hoping that we'll have a more coherent answer to the question of, is the Tibetan movement a lost cause, more coherent than the one that I'm giving now. But my feeling is that in terms of any sort of political independence of Tibet, that is not going to be possible in my lifetime, certainly, and that what one should focus on is protection and strengthening of Tibetan language culture, which includes Tibetan Buddhist religion. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening statements, opening remarks, Dr. Dillon. And allow me to bring in Ambassador Phunchok Stobdan at this time. Ambassador, what would your assessment be? Is Tibet losing traction globally? And where would you stand on the whole debate if President Xi were to retain power in the end? Would that sound a death knell as far as the Tibetan resistance movement is concerned?
Thank you very much. Pleasure meeting all of you. Of course, I've read some of the writings of Dr. Dorje and Dr. Tobgyal. I'm not a student of Tibet politics, so I don't know much about what's happening on the movement. But, unless you are an astrologer, one cannot be definitive about whether the Tibet cause is lost or not. Nobody can predict. In international relation, things are so dynamic that nobody could think about Xi Jinping is going to be thrown out from power. The report now says that all the trains and air tickets have been cancelled in China. It could still be a rumor. We really don't know how things are shaping inside China. Now, the issue is not about Tibet. The issue is about China. Whether Tibet gains or loses, it mainly depends on what happens to the future of China. Now, we've heard in the 80s that Soviet Union is not going to be collapsing. Some people wrote some books about the coming collapse of Soviet Union, but Soviet Union collapsed. So I don't think China is going to collapse the way Soviet Union has collapsed. China has learned a lot of lessons, especially on the economic side and other field also. But, in this world, which is so interconnected now, nothing can be so sure about the future about China. It may not disintegrate, it may not collapse. The Communist Party of China may still not collapse. Another generation may continue because my age group would still be very fanatic. But the generation after me would be slightly lesser in terms of communist orthodoxy. I would expect that things would change in China, say next 20 to 30 years. It's going to be completely different. What I see in meanwhile is that China might get diffused in terms of power, in terms of region, in terms of ethnicity and culture, because China.
You're breaking up, Ambassador Stobdan.
Because of that, I think
Ambassador
Hello?
Stobdan, I think you're breaking up. You're breaking up.
Is it okay?
I think you're still breaking up. There's some issues with the internet, Ambassador Stobdan. Am I audible?
Yeah, I'm at a very remote place. I don't have Wi-Fi here. Using private data.
Right, you're fine now. Please continue, sir.
Okay, so the issue in Tibet, the issue is about China. And I don't think that one can debate about Tibetan movement, but whether it is or not a lost case is somebody's guess. I don't think issue like Tibet can be forgotten or can be written off so easily. It will continue, but in what shape and what capacity or what kind of pattern it may take, that's one is not able to understand. Two speakers before me gave different perspective, one the Chinese perspective, the other the Tibetan perspective. Sitting in India, I don't get the kind of feeling which anchor has expressed that it is an between India and China. I haven't seen anything about Tibet in our bilateral agenda. You are right that His Holiness Dalai Lama is a respected guest in India. That's true. More of a cultural connotation that continue even more now. I expect that in 10 years, this will reverberate more in the context of Tibet, because we are still now to learn a lot of things from Tibetan culture back from into Indian. I mean, I'm aware about the fact new project has just taken off on the translation of all the Tibetan text into Sanskrit directly, say for last 900 years or 100 years, old text has to be translated. We have everything. Now, that is mainly because now for old cultural ethos. In that context, the near and the closest that we can learn from is from the. So this aspect about the culture of Tibet is going to assume even more importantly in the Indian policy perspective. But I don't know whether it has a policy perspective, a political policy perspective on Tibet. I haven't come across in the last so many years. You come across in newspapers, some people keep on writing about Tibet card and all that thing, but it's not so easy. A poor country like India to take up the cause of Tibet in such a big scale. Time has not come as yet to do that. Instead, I do see issues that concerns India in terms of their own territorial integrity, in terms of Tibet. For example, in the coming years, the issue of Mount Kailash is going to be taken up very seriously by Indian masses. Now that impinges on our Tibet policy or China policy, I don't know, is going to be a serious issue. But otherwise, I don't see Tibet per se is going to be forgotten so easily. What I do see here is the problem within the Tibetan politics of not going back to the Tibetan empire. This is where the Tibetan identity lies. Tibetan identity doesn't lie in Buddhism. China also has Buddhism. Buddhism is everywhere. Buddha is a universal. So one cannot use Buddhism as a pretext to fight any national cause or something like that. That's a wrong approach. I do see overemphasizing on religious identity as a source of movement. And there are others, who take it as a moral movement, Gandhian movement or something like that, which is not the case in the context of Tibet. Tibetan real identity lies in the Tibetan Empire, which collapsed somewhere in the 8th, 9th century. And since then, I think the Tibet has gone wrong everywhere. And a Yuan dynasty came, Ming dynasty came, and the Qing dynasty came. It was like, the Indians living under Mughals or a Portuguese or the British or something like that. That part of history, or say 1,000 years of Tibetan history, is a very, very sad thing. I believe that somebody will correct this aspect of Tibetan identity and history. Tibetan Empire is the correct way of looking at the identity of Tibet. Other than that, I don't know, in the modern age, you can really carry forward in the context of, say, even the reincarnation. I don't know how many states will have in their constitution a place for reincarnation. Even in my own country, we don't have a place in Indian constitution for reincarnation. There is no such thing. There is a rebirth theory in the Hindu culture, but that's not part of our constitution. So the political legitimacy comes from constitutional authority. This is where I think the playing around all this cultural, religious debate is sometimes it's risky and it's not good for Tibetan, because end of the day, it is the 6 million Tibetans whose future matters, not what happens to me in terms of philosophy or metaphysics or something like that. The people living inside Tibet is very important.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador Stobdan. Indeed, 6 million Tibetans, that's their future at stake here. And I'd like to bring in Dr. Tshering Tobgyal at this moment. Dr. Tobgyal, your opening remarks on whether you see the Tibetan movement and the general acceptance and the conversation around it globally, is it fading away, or are you in agreement with the others who think that no, it's going to revive itself in the next, say, 10, 20, 30 years down the line?
Thank you, Apurva and Argumentative Indian, for inviting me and making me part of this discussion. I really appreciate what all three previous speakers said. I heard about them. I engaged with some of their work, so it's a pleasure for me to share this virtual platform with them. With regards to the topic of whether the Tibet movement is a lost cause, this is not a new question, and I do understand the sentiment and the reasons behind asking this kind of question, particularly at this juncture. In 2002, 2003, when I was just fresh out of university, I took part in a street activity in New York City, and a passerby shouted, just give up, Tibet is a lost cause, and his wife immediately apologized to us and said, he had some mental issues. But, it just goes to show that, this kind of question is nothing new and has been, going on for, many decades. And I do understand the reasons why you are asking this question, not just for the reasons that you identified, but also, from the perspective of, Chinese policies inside Tibet, China's greater sort of influence and clout around the world, and the tendency of states and actors around the world to play nice and try to sort of engage with the Chinese for all kinds of reasons, and also what is going on the ground in terms of the Tibetan community in exile. His Holiness, as Dr. Dengzi Dorji pointed out, is advanced in age and is not able to carry out many of the sort of more political activities now. And then as a result of the recent democratic elections, there has been sort of internal disunity and squabbles going on, and also the sort of decline in the number of Tibetans escaping to India, which has knock-on impact on the number of students, in the Tibetan schools in India, the monasteries in India, and other sort of institutions, and also the increasing number of Tibetans going to Western countries, and the declining sort of birth rate in the Tibetan community in South Asia as well. So for all kinds of reasons, I do understand why you are asking this question and trying to have a discussion. But I would also like to caution against sort of making sweeping conclusions, coming to sweeping conclusions, and also premature sort of dismissal, which is sort of implied in the title of our discussion today, right? And as I think some of my colleagues previously talked about, at the height of the British Empire, similar questions may have been asked about the Indian freedom movement, right? But we know, how history played out and where we are today in terms of India's freedom. And also, as I think Ambassador Thopton pointed out, about the Soviet Union, we can go back in time and ask the Lithuanians, the Estonians, and all the other post-Soviet and post-Yugoslav states, not to mention states like East Timor, which is closer to, Tibet. So it's too soon to come to sort of judgments, and also we should caution against making premature sort of dismissals. But as a political scientist, I have to take sort of terms and concepts, seriously. So when we say the Tibet movement, right, we have to ask, what do we mean by that? And has there been a such a thing as a Tibet movement in the first place, right? So are we talking about the Tibetan exile community, exile establishment in South Asia, or are we talking about the situation or the political sort of movement inside Tibet, or are we talking about the international sort of civil society movement or around Tibet, or are we talking about the responses of the broader international community on Tibet issues? So we can have a separate discussion at each of these different levels, right? So please do stop me if I go too much over time, but I will very quickly try to say something broad about each of these levels, right? So inside Tibet, obviously it is a function of Chinese policies, as others have pointed out. Chinese policies, especially under Xi Jinping, has been very sort of draconian, very hardline and assimilationist. We hear about things like Sinicization of Tibetan Buddhism and the sort of imposition of Mandarin language teaching in the schools, hurting Tibetan children as young as primary school into boarding schools where they are taught in Mandarin and according to sort of Chinese values, things like that. So it's all sort of dependent upon Chinese policies. But for someone who looks at sort of very flashy and prominent displays of resistance, like self-immolations or street protests or armed struggles, we can see that in the recent periods, we haven't seen much of that in Tibet. And which I think fits into perceptions of even serious scholars. One of my professors at the University of California pointed out in a very famous China scholar pointed out to me that Tibet has now become the new model minority, right, which used to be the Mongols in the past. So, but resistance doesn't always take those forms, right? Obviously, in Tibet, we have seen periodic sort of riots and protests and self-immolations, but resistance takes place in a lot of less sort of prominent, forms. So if someone is sort of seriously observing the sort of the media coming out of Tibet, the social media discussions, the literature coming out of Tibet, the music and things like that, you can see that Tibetan identity is very, very strong, and the sense of sort of discontent, dissatisfaction is very, very high. History also points out that Tibetans sort of go through cycles of conformity to some extent, and then various forms of daily sort of forms of resistance, and then explosions like the 1959 uprising, 1987 uprising, the 2008 uprising, and the self-immolations, right? So depending on their calculations on the ground of the costs and benefits of resisting China, we will see also Tibetans taking action in the future, various types of action. So quickly moving into the South Asia, the exile community, obviously I pointed out some of the recent developments which give rise to these kind of questions, right? Question marks about the stability and sustainability of the exile community. But it is not necessarily all bad, right? Because yes, the number of students are going down, number of Tibetan entrants into the monasteries are going down, but that is also an opportunity for the Tibetan schools and monasteries to emphasize quality over quantity, right, in terms of education. And I think it is also a very good opportunity for Tibetans to strengthen their bonds with the culturally, people in India, Indian Himalayas, Nepal, Bhutan, and to strengthen these bonds, because these schools and institutions are already taking a number of people from these areas where sort of their traditional identities, whether in terms of language, religion, have and that sort of distance from Tibet and the Tibetans has increased over generations. So I think it's an opportunity to reach out and serve these communities. If you go to the Nepalese and Indian Himalayas, there are very remote places where people live in under dire consequences, and children don't get proper education. So I think it's a good opportunity. But also Tibetans moving to West is not always necessarily bad, because when in the past, if you look at the membership and leaders of the Tibet support groups in the West, they are mostly Western, right? But now, because of the increasing Tibetans and the Tibetans educated in the West, having different kinds of skills, they have taken over the mantle of speaking for Tibet and lobbying for Tibet in DC and other Western capitals, right? And young Tibetans growing up with native English fluency or the other languages in the West, they are, I think, in some ways better sort of messengers or ambassadors or lobbyists for Tibet, right? So, and then internationally, I'll just sum up by saying, going back to the point you made about whether the moral compass of the states and leaders of the West has been lost. But I would come back to you by saying, has the moral compass of the international community, particularly the leaders and governments, been there in the first place? If you go back to the British Raj and look at what Lord Curzon, for example, said about Tibet, he said we have to always avoid the wrath of the Chinese government when dealing with Tibet, right? He was talking about importance of economic trade with the Chinese empire and then the successor states regimes, and also the sort of military strategic dimensions of playing nice with China. So whether you look at India, Indian government policy, or British or American or any other states, the realpolitik has always overcome more sort of humanitarian and moral sort of calculations, right? So I would say nothing has changed on that front. So I'll conclude here and would look forward to observations, critiques, and discussion later on.
Thank you, Dr. Tobgyal, and thank you, gentlemen, for your remarks. You have raised a host of topics and issues, and I'd like to begin with Dr. Michael Dillon, in fact, and I'd like to discuss specifically His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Now, the worldwide, when you observe it, Dalai Lama is seen as a face of peace, love, and compassion. To the Tibetan people, he's a vanguard of the national identity and a living Buddha. But to the Chinese, he's a dangerous demon, or as one of the CCP official puts it, a wolf dressed in monk's robes. Dr. Dillon, what explains this anger of the Chinese, or this hostile attitude that they have towards Dalai Lama? Because again, he's an octogenarian, retired from political life, pursuing his spiritual goals. What threat is he at all to the Chinese?
Well, I think he probably isn't any threat at all to the Chinese, is he? But as I can't remember, one of our colleagues is pointing out, China is an atheist state. The Chinese Communist Party dislikes any sort of religion, acts against it, frankly doesn't understand religion. My view is that even if one doesn't accept a religious belief, one should respect it. Generally speaking, that is not done in China, and it applies to Islam, it applies to Christianity. In the case of the Dalai Lama, they simply treat him as a political figure. They don't treat him as, you've described quite correctly the way he's seen in Tibet, as this sort of inspirational figure, I mean, he comes across as a thoroughly decent chap. I have never met him, but the sort of person you would have a great deal of respect for in person as well as his writing. But I think it's what he represents. And partly it's because he is outside of China. And again, I think it's not just the Dalai Lama that they're getting at when they're using these ridiculous, colourful terms. It's his entourage, and we have to remember that the government in exile in Dharamsala, there are military and political leaders there. Clearly, there isn't any sort of army that is a threat to China. But they associate the Dalai Lama with the 1959 uprising, which Dr. Topgal has just referred to. And in many ways, the 1959 uprising still has not been resolved because as a result of that, certain areas of old Tibet were lost to China. And so they're now in provinces such as Sichuan, Qinghai, and even, I think there are some in, well, I can't remember what I said now, Sichuan, anyway. But parts of it were hived off, and these are areas that many Tibetans would like to see returned to Ambassador Stockton's traditional Chinese Tibetan empire, if we were able to go back to that. So I think that it's the ideas behind the Dalai Lama, the Tibetanness, and the opposition that the Chinese dislike. Why it is expressed in such terrible personal terms, I don't know. You may or may not know, but I wrote a biography of Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai got on quite famously well with the Dalai Lama, and Zhou Enlai was Chinese, but he was a very different sort of Communist Party member from somebody like Xi Jinping. Could I just take up one point I think that came up in Dr. Yao and also some of the other comments? And that is, I mean, I do take this point that, what is the Tibetan movement? And perhaps we should define our terms more closely. But one area where you see a Tibetan movement is in the Tibetan diaspora, in the exile. I mean, I've become aware of people in the UK and other parts of Europe, in North America, particularly. I don't really have much to do with the Tibetans in India. And it's quite clear that there is a determination to retain and strengthen language. I think language is vital from the point of view of identity. And this is a problem that Tibetans in Tibet have, whether they go for bilingualism with Mandarin Chinese, which perhaps in an ideal world you would say they should have, but is there a danger that in learning Chinese as well as Tibetan, you lose your Tibetanness? It's not only in Tibet that problem arises. It arises in Xinjiang, it arises in Inner Mongolia, and frankly, it arises in the United Kingdom with minority languages here. So, but in the diaspora, I think there are, that is where the Tibetan movement, if such a thing exists, will continue, will mature. And if you look at what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where did the new leaders and the new intellectual leaders of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia come from? In many cases, from the diaspora. And I think the importance of the Tibetan diaspora is absolutely enormous. In many ways, I think the Dharamsala community is not typical of the other diasporas because it's effectively a government in exile. I'm thinking of the wider Tibetan diaspora.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Dillon. And at this moment, I'd like to bring in Dr. Tenzing Dorji, specifically on the point that was raised by Dr. Tshering Topgyal regarding the sincerity of the Western nations or just the global comity of nations when it comes to Tibet. I have a fact here which says that the Tibet Rights Collective reports that it has been 24 years since a UN Human Rights Commissioner visited Tibet and no investigation has taken place regarding the treatment of Tibetans, while arbitrary detentions and enforced disappearances are commonplace. Now, that's not very reassuring from the United Nations, is it now, Dr. Tenzing Dorji?
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think the recent United Nations Human Rights Commissioners visiting China, and I think Tibetans have asked that the commissioner should also visit Tibet, but that didn't happen. So as you know, I think that I also agree with Ambassador Topton's remark that when we talk about Tibet, he said it's not just about Tibet, it's about China. There is also some truth in the matter. The world, from China's perspective, I suppose they think that Tibet issue is resolved because they have invaded and they have been occupying, oppressing for over six decades. But the China exists as becoming a rising superpower, and the world has to, deal with that. And China's, I think, buck doesn't stop with Tibet. China has been recently very aggressive to take Taiwan. They would do militarily. United States of America, President Biden said twice very clearly, we will defend, Taiwan should that happen. China has been always infiltrating into India's territories, right? They still claim Arunachal Pradesh is a part of Tibet, South Tibet. And India has to deal with that. One of the remarks Ambassador Topton made, which kind of brings a deja vu. Before Buddhism came to Tibet, Tibet was a warrior, right, tribe, and not a peaceful one. So I don't know whether to thank our Guru India for making us very peaceful. As a matter of fact, our Guru is very peaceful dealing with China. I sometimes feel, with due respect, I love Indians. It's just my spiritual home. Maybe our Guru need to be compassionately wrathful deities, like a Hayagriva, Vajra Bhairava, dealing with China a little bit. I know India knows Tibet's case, and inside we know the story. And I know India has tough time, but at the same time, India has to master its wrathfulness, because once the international led China to take over, let's say Taiwan, China is going to come after Arunachal Pradesh, and Ladakh was somewhere, we don't know. Yeah. And also I want to relate to Dr. Dillon's remark about Chinese perspective. Yes, China claims, 5 national minorities, Tibetans are one of them. But unfortunately, China's nationalism is rising, but there's a Han nationalism. I personally experienced that in 2008 during Olympics. I was a doctoral student at University of California, Santa Barbara. I was surrounded by 100 Chinese students, right? And I got my Tibetan flag, they got their Chinese flag. And I said, why don't you respect, my flag? I'll respect yours. And let's have a dialogue, right? Peaceful. No, they were trying to throw me under the truck. And so China is very nationalistic, very assertive, aggressive. And so I think if I am among the leadership of India, that will keep me awake during night. And as much as we want to be very peaceful, we don't know. If any war breaks, I don't think there's winning and all. If the third war breaks, everybody is going to be loser. So there is end of the storyline, Tibet or not. So there are issues like that. China always claimed Tibet historically to be inalienable part of China, but that's a lie. Very recently, a Chinese retired professor of, I think, City of Hong Kong University, Professor Hong Long-Shou, he published in National Security, Tibet was never part of China historically during Ming and Qing dynasties. He looked at primary resources in Chinese, and there was nothing that said Tibet was part of China. So this is a lie that tried to spread out. And the act that is the United States House right now, promoting resolution to Sino-Tibetan Conflict Act, is also challenging that China's false claim over Tibet, and they think that international has to come to decide the status of Tibet. And also I want to kind of I think link to Dr. Topton's case, where we do struggle right now, to the extent I know that half the Tibetan diasporas from India have moved to the West. Yeah. And our monasteries are struggling to get recruits. Our schools are struggling to get recruits. So our real base in India, so that's one of the struggles we deal with. In the West, we struggle to teach our Tibetan children language. We don't have separate schools. We don't have separate communities as we do in India. So India has done humanitarian the most for the Tibetans. But I must say that still the real Tibet exists in India, culturally speaking. Our monasteries are there, our home base is there. In Tibet, when I was a chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, every year we have rated China as the country of particular concern. The worst case, restricting religious freedom in Tibet across China and restricting language. I agree with Dr. Dillon, that maybe they should adopt additive bilingualism. Yeah, teach Chinese, I understand, because you're occupying the land, but let the Tibetans learn Tibetans as well. When they try to force mentoring on Tibetans, Tibetan resistance learn them to keep the Tibetan identity more clearly. As a matter of fact, many great Tibetan teachers, language teachers in India, they came from Tibet. So inside Tibet, sort of underground, Tibetans are very strong with their language study and everything else. So the Tibetan resistance in Tibet, as His Holiness said, the majority they are there, they never give up. So therefore, that is the strength of the Tibet movement, going forward. And of course, I'm not a political scientist like my colleague, Dr. Sring Tobgyal, but I'm also intercultural scholar. So we love to define concept. So what is Tibet movement? The way I took it, it captures all of the things he listed, right? The Central Tibetan Administration in India, the Tibet support groups in the West, and the Tibetan activists, individuals, and the international support. So all of them put together for me is a Tibet movement at the moment. And in the United States, officially, and in the European Parliament, they have strongly supported the middle way approach to resolve peacefully through dialogue or Sino-Tibetan conflict. So there has been strong support for that, but I also understand that in the Tibetan communities, everybody doesn't agree with that, right? There are young Tibetans, especially Tibetan Youth Congress, they want to fight for Tibetan independence. I want to acknowledge that. And historically, we were independent, and we have every right. I grew up in India, studying in India schools. India fought for independence. India did not fight for anything else. So fighting less than independence is not in the mind of Tibetan education. But yet, because of His Holiness leadership, because of the situation right now, so we have come forward with middle way, non-violent approach to resolve issue. And I personally feel that's the best way to go forward. And I publish things on that writing and things like that.
Thank you, Dr. Dorji. Can I bring in Dr. Tobgyal at this time? Because again, that's the problem, isn't it? The Chinese perspective draws from misinterpretation of Chinese texts, while it is largely agreed that any interpretation when it comes to Tibetan history has to be from empirical Tibetan texts. Now, that's not the case with the Chinese historians or the Chinese point of view, is it now, Dr. Tobgyal?
Yeah, I would agree, with your supposition that any sort of interpretation of Tibet's legal status or Tibetan right to self-determination or any kind of political status has to be based on at least on the examination of Tibetan documents. But at least since the around the 13th century, as Ambassador Topten pointed out, Tibetans have been living under other sort of foreign polities, at points, but also at other times, maintaining sort of succeeding in various levels of autonomy or even independence, right? So we also need to look at the texts of the Mongols, the Manchus, and the Chinese, and in fact. Scholars of Tibetan history have looked at not just the Tibetan texts but also the Chinese imperial documents like dynastic records and imperial records to come to the conclusion that Tibet was not considered part of, for example, Ming China, right? If you look at the work of Elliot Sperling, who looked at both Chinese and Tibetan texts, comes to that judgment, right? But you also need to recognize the complexity of history, right? Because if you are a state or a community or person who would like to learn lessons from history and would like to improve one's own sort of status or situation in the future, we have to be honest about history and see history as it is, so that we learn lessons, right? So it's important to look at sort of the other languages as well. But if I may quickly take a minute to go back to my point about realpolitik, which has to do with how India or Western governments deal with China. Obviously, I did not mean that there was no support of any kind from India or the Western governments. In fact, at the level of civil society and common people, there has always been great level of support for Tibet. And even at the governmental level, there have been sort of resolutions passed in the parliaments and congresses around the Western countries. So there has been that kind of support, awards given to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and also sort of expressions of support for autonomy or for dialogue between the Tibetans. But none of the states have taken any sort of concrete steps to make that happen, right? One sort of one change that we observe is in the 1980s and 1990s, when one can make the case that the Tibet movement was quite strong. Most of the actions at the governmental level or at the civil society level were quite symbolic expressions of support, right? Resolutions passed, awards given, right? But I think more recently, we see, for example, in legislation in the United States, there has been sort of more legally binding and more practical forms of support, right? Particularly, funding for Tibetan sort of projects, and also requiring the state government or the administration to do certain things on Tibet, right? And report back to the Congress. So I think that there has been sort of the movement, if we want to call it, has changed. We don't see a lot of visibility, but it has sort of changed its nature, right? So one final point I would like to make in that regard is, about realpolitik. When Western governments and even India look at Tibet, right? Their policies or their use of the Tibet issue has changed according to their relationship with China and to what extent they needed China, right? So, for example, 1950s, 60s, Americans even funded the Tibetan guerrilla, resistance, right? Because they saw China more as a threat. But when they needed China against the Soviet Union, then they ditched that form of support for the Tibetans, right? And then similarly, with regard to India, as soon as India had the 1962 war with China, they started the 1922 Vikas division, and I think it was more assertive in sort of, or more visible in using the Tibet issue, right? Now that China is being seen increasingly as a threat or a challenge, I think the way the Western governments and even Indian government will engage with the Tibet issue will also change. And the Tibetans will need to observe these changes and be able to take advantage of the opportunities if they present. But we should not have any illusion that that is what will be the deciding factor, right? What will be the deciding factor about Tibet's future will be how the Tibetans inside Tibet, which is the biggest portion, stay as Tibetans, how their identities evolve, how their calculation of interest and how they view China sort of changes, right? Even the exile community, which is small, which is important, as Dr. Dillon pointed out, which is important. But I think the deciding factor will be what the Tibetans inside Tibet do, and that will also relate to Chinese policies, shifting Chinese policies.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Chiring Tobgyal. And now let me come to Ambassador Phunchok Stobdan. Ambassador, I've kept you waiting for so long. I apologize for that, but I have two very specific questions for you. And we have discussed a wide range when it comes to the Tibet issue on this special discussion on argumentative Indians. But I'd like to get a sense from you, considering that you have had a long and distinguished career as a diplomat. What's your sense when you look at the Indian approach, the Indian strategy towards, I beg your pardon, solving the Tibet issue? Because one gets the sense that there is no consistent policy from the Indian side when it comes to Tibet. There has been a strategic silence, as many call it, when it comes to bilateral statements or any sort of statement from the Indian side at all. Recently, I've had the Indian administration wish the birthday greetings to His Holiness, and that has caused a huge uproar, not just in China, but also globally. You have had the allies of China chiming in and saying, well, what's the need for that? So I'd like to get a sense from you as to, is there a consistent policy from the Indian side when it comes to Tibet in countering in the discussions with China? And number two, as one of our panelists was mentioning, that Tibet is the the third pole of the whole region. So this culture, this environmental extractivism that is going on in Tibet, the rivers drying up, do you think that's going to be a flashpoint in the near future, considering that water wars is one possibility that many experts have predicted?
Well, Dr. Dorji has mentioned Indians know about Tibet. Equally, it's true for the Tibet. They know about the Indian position about. I don't have to elaborate. The last 60 years history is open history. What the Indian state has done, what they have not done. So there's nothing much to say about what India could have done or what India can do now in future. I do not see at the moment what the Prime Minister has congratulated or somebody wished, birthday to somebody. In politics, it's also important to have space for posturings. Now, these posturings are very important. What happened in Samarkand a week ago, it was full of posturings by Xi Jinping, by Prime Minister Modi, with regards to Ukraine and Russia, Putin, and all that. So, in many ways, international relation runs on posturings, less on substance. But with regards to Tibet, I think the Indian position is more of a posturing from time to time, according to the needs. Many people believe that Tibet is very important to pinprick the Chinese. Nothing more, nothing less. If they do not support so banning a terrorist in the UNAC based in Pakistan, then the India could raise the issue of Tibet somewhere in some form or the other. But I haven't seen anything very blatant about Tibet in the recent decades. I mean, forget about government, even in newspapers, I have not seen a particular editorial devoted to Tibet in the last 20 years. Until 80s, the Indian media used to be full of Tibet. It has all receded now. All the newspapers are now today controlled by Indian companies, business companies, and they're doing good business with Chinese. So it's not a very simple case about one particular individual deciding the Tibet policy in Delhi. There are a whole lot of actors in India who've got a lot of stakes with the Chinese. As I said, it's not so much about Tibet, it's about our relationship with China. If relationship with China goes down, the Tibet issue comes up. It's like a barometer, it's just a temperature which ups and goes up and comes down. I do not see, except for some security issues. My own understanding, Government of India has full faith in the Dharamshala system, but there are also Tibetans within Tibet who give very accurate information to the Communist Party of China about what is to be done with regards to India, especially along the borders. Han Chinese know nothing about, say, Himalayas. It's all the Tibetan knowledge, Tibetan expertise, and the Tibetan skill which is used by PLA or the Chinese Communist Party with regards to dealing with, so the Western Theater Command, we know how many militaries. Also, the issue is, it's not a case about supporting Tibet or not. The scenario keep on changing. But now we keep, Tibetans have joined PLA forces. Now, why would the Tibetan join PLA forces? Either it could be there is no nationalism in Tibet, or it bread and butter for their career, like do in India. Most of people join Indian Army. Not so much about nationalism is driving us to join army, but for jobs and employment. One is not sure about what is happening on the other side of this. So it's a constant changing dynamics. So one cannot say that Indian policy is likely to be less. But I don't see the one China is going to change very soon now. Many people thought that after Taiwan crisis, things would change in India with regards to, but there is also our understanding whatever Chinese have done in the couple of, the kind of belligerency they have shown, aggressiveness they have shown on the border, or in the Indo-Pacific region, in the South China Sea, where has benefited India. A weak China is not likely to benefit India, because India's own importance has gone up because of the Chinese power. India has taken very seriously today calculation with regards to Ukraine, with regards to everything, partly because China is rising. So I think if you look at broader strategic perspective, the Indians are very careful about what they say, what they don't say. So somewhere Tibet falls, but Tibet is an old that India had, so it will continue. But there are also realization China has more serious problem like Hong Kong, like Taiwan. We don't have a chapter open on Xinjiang, although we have border with Xinjiang. We have old friends in Xinjiang. We used to have a consulate in Kashgar. We used to have a lot of assets in Xinjiang. I myself been to many times. We have a lot of friends there. But partly because of radicalism or extremism, chapter cannot be. In fact, the Chinese are quite supportive of Indian position in Afghanistan or in Central Asia. Recently in SCO, so happy about Indian position on fighting terrorism and all that stuff, partly because India is doing their job. Right. If India can fight against terrorism, it solves their problem also in Xinjiang. So I think the Chinese are a very complicated nation, complicated people. One cannot easily understand. It's an art to understand Chinese. It's not a normal political science that you understand China like that. Even if you speak the best Mandarin language, you still do not know China. So you have to feel China. You have to be with the Chinese for a very long time. My understanding of China was I was in outer Mongolia for a very long time, and there were a lot of Chinese there. So a little bit of how the Chinese think, the Manchus think, especially the Mongols think. So it's a very indirect way of trying to understand China, which is quite helpful to me. And but then Chinese are like that. Intrinsically, Chinese are very aggressive people. The history has shown that. We can't do much about that. What we can do is to best manage China, deal with China, possibly without so much cost against ourselves. But I think Tibet is a very important issue. It's still in the mind of a lot of people in the world. Particularly the Mahayana Buddhism. It's a very cherished philosophy regarded by a lot of people, and the world has to learn a lot with regards to the Tibetan Buddhism. I like that part, but mixing Tibetan Buddhism with politics is a bit of a problem. I was in Mongolia. There was this Kushok Bakula, who was a Ladakhi High Lama, who was our ambassador there. I happened to go there for some official reasons. And in the evening, the ambassador called me for dinner. And I asked him, how do you find Mongolia and how you deal with the Mongol Buddhism? He said, no, the Lamas here are very tough. They're very not good people here. The Lamas don't listen to me. I said, why don't they listen to you? He said, look, they asked me to teach a lot of things in the monasteries, but all of them have their wives. They drink a lot of alcohol and they eat a lot of meat. I said, look, I cannot keep preaching if you marry and if you drink and if you, have your wives and all these things. Then they get annoyed and they don't listen to Kushok Bakula. And I said that I told Kushok Bakula, the Mongols are very practical people. And so I told the Khambo Lama, the Mongolian head, said, our ambassador is not very happy with you people. Why don't you listen to him properly? Oh, there are a lot of such lamas keep coming here, Tibetan lamas, Indian lamas. They keep telling us don't marry, don't have alcohol, or don't consume meat. He says, tell him that, look, we have to fight against the Chinese. We are only 2 million people. We need soldiers. We need to marry her. We must have wives. We have to produce children. Otherwise, they eat up in one breakfast. So please tell him that he understands this. And he says he tells us we're in -40 temperature. They don't have brinjals or some the spinach or some vegetable grown in Siberia. So what can we eat? Having alcohol is like so. What they were trying to say is Buddhism is very important for us, but ours is very important for us. So the state religion extremely important for living in that area. Unfortunately, in Himalayas, most people are extremely devoted to the religion, and this is like in terms of science, in terms of education, in terms of living with the world in a practical way.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador Phunchok Stobdan. We have covered a host of discussion, a host of issues that are related to the Tibetan resistance movement in the last 70 odd minutes, and we're coming to the end of this session here. But before that, I'd like to invite all my panelists to answer one final question before we wrap up for this evening. And I'll like to begin with Dr. Michael Dillon. Dr. Dillon, your closing remarks on the Tibetan issue, and more specifically, if I had to ask you, do you think that if President Xi were to be re-elected, would that be the end of the Tibetan resistance movement? Or do you think that, as our other panelists mentioned, that this movement will live on and it will revive itself? It's something that's going to live on in the people's hearts and minds, and it's not something that the Chinese can erase very easily.
No, I don't think it'll be the end, whether Xi Jinping continues or not. I mean, if he's replaced by somebody with a more open-minded attitude, that would be better for the Tibetan people, because they'll be able to move around more freely, practice their religion. If I could just make one point, going back to the whole realpolitik idea. The whole question of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees has been mentioned a few times. We've had this report recently on Xinjiang, and somebody's mentioned Michelle Batelet's visit to Xinjiang. Well, a few days, and she didn't go anywhere near the main Uyghur areas. And she had to fight to get that report out, and she only released it just before she left office. And I think this indicates the difficulty of an organization like the United Nations, which is a member organization, and the Chinese at the moment have a great deal of authority in that. I would like to see a United Nations High Commission report on Tibet, and I've argued for this one on Xinjiang, and I would certainly argue for one on Tibet in the future. But no, I don't think the Tibet movement will finish at all.
Thank you, Dr. Michael Dillon. Can I bring in Dr. Tenzing Dorji at this moment, please?
Yes, thank you very much. In conclusion, I want to say that, Tibet issue is a very complex issue. It's not just about Tibet and Tibetans. From a geopolitical point of view, as I said, Tibet is the water tower of Asia. It is the roof of the world. It's the roof casing. The whole world probably will go together with it. And China is a very formidable adversary. That is a rising power, is very nationalistic, very aggressive. And so we need a really national, I think, policies and corporations to deal with China, whether it's on Tibet issue or any other issue, because we definitely don't want to see any third world war happening in any part of the world, because that will be the end of the whole world, as far as I'm concerned. And I know India is a very careful country. I don't know any country that's more careful than India, but sometimes I feel like overly careful. Correct me, I've got it wrong. I think in recent times, at least some Indian militaries are taught Tibetan history. That's good.
Yes.
If India wants to know more about China, maybe they should push to have an embassy in Tibet, right? Just like United States, we said reciprocal access to Tibet. Until you let us open a new embassy or consulate in Lhasa, we won't let you do it here. So maybe India should try to do that for its own sake. I feel for India that India is surrounded by China and not so friendly neighbors there, Pakistan and Nepal, and so it's tough part. So anything can change in politics. Nobody knows about the future. Future is uncertain. Anything can happen, and so there I'll stop it.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Dorji. In fact, I'm happy to report it to you that the Indian Army has begun Tibetology courses for its officers and Jawans very recently. And Tibetan awareness is being given a major thrust, not just in schools and colleges, but also in administrative institutes and training institutions. On that note, let me bring in Dr. Chiring Topgyal. Dr. Topgyal, your assessment of this whole topic, and more specifically, do you think that countries are hesitant to talk about the Tibet issue at times, not just because of the Chinese might that is in front of them, but also because they have their own skeletons in the closet and they don't want to upset the apple cart?
Yeah, before I make my concluding remark and answer your question, I would like to go back to or respond to Ambassador Stopden's points. I do sense a bit of, I think, unnecessary, undue sort of suspicion, against, Tibetans inside Tibet, or Tibetans living in exile, from the point of view of Indian security or Indian interests, which I think Ambassador Stopden has in mind, right? For example, when talking about the Tibetans in the PLA, it is not a new development. There have been Tibetans in the PLA, since the 1950s and 60s. In fact, a few of the Tibetans who formed Vikas 22 early on were actually PLA soldiers who defected, right? And there was even a Chinese a soldier who defected and came along with the Tibetans. It has been going on, right? And then I think Ambassador Stopden was talking about not using Buddhism, as a political sort of weapon or instrument. I think it goes back to my point about, Tibetan exile institutions reaching out and serving, the people in the Indian Himalayas who share the same religion, language, and other sort of cultural values with the Tibetans, right? So, to some extent, it is, just a cultural sort of social welfare kind of, attitude, but one cannot always rule out the use of these kind of connections for political purposes. But if you are a Ladakhi or a Mönba in Arunachal Pradesh, or some person in Himachal Pradesh or Uttarakhand, if you want to live and preserve your identity as a Ladakhi, right? Particularly a Ladakhi Buddhist, for example, or a Mönba, I would suggest that if Tibet disappears as a civilization, you will also cease as a live as a Ladakhi, because as a consequence of market forces, immigration. I know we are talking about the distant future, but we would also cease to see people called Ladakhi people, right? If the Tibetan civilization disappears, so there are interests from the point of view of the people of these regions to also reach out to the Tibetans and strengthen the bonds, the historical bonds that we had, right? At some point, Ambassador Stobdan talked about the Tibetan Empire, but these places became Tibetan Buddhists or people speaking Tibetan language because they came under either under the Tibetan Empire or Tibetan soldiers moved to these areas, even in Baltistan in Pakistan, right? So I think it's not sort of useful to be too suspicious of Tibetans, whether inside Tibet or in India, right? So my concluding remark will be very short, right? Tibet, as a movement, particularly in South Asia or in Tibet itself, will not cease to exist. If Tibetans lived under, I think, far more draconian sort of control during the Cultural Revolution or the time before that, right, where monasteries were physically decimated, monks and nuns were disrobed, singing Tibetan songs and opera was, persecuted, but we still emerged out of that as a result of policy change. And then at the same time, the travel of Tibetans inside and outside also stopped at that point, more or less, during the Cultural Revolution, right, which is something going on today as well. But as Professor Michael Dillon pointed out, there may be new leaders and policy change in the future. So I think as a movement, as well as travel of ideas, people between the diaspora and Tibet may also be re-established in the future. But to very quickly respond to your question, definitely, Western governments had colonized various parts of the world and done a lot of nasty things. America also has its own skeleton, as you pointed out. So it is not always helpful, but it is also not helpful to sort of draw unnecessary sort of moral equivalences, right? It's important to see these policies and actions of these different states at different historical contexts in their right context and come to judgments.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chering Topgyal, for your insights. And I'll finally come to Ambassador Phunchok Stobdan. Ambassador Stobdan, the final word is all yours. What are your expectations for the Tibetan resistance movement going forward? And I'd ask you the same question that I asked Dr. Topgyal too, that our country is actually hesitant to engage with China on the Tibet topic, specifically because they might have their own skeletons and they are just hesitant to do it in the first place.
Yeah, that's why it's very important that we must believe in the multipolar world, because China dominating the world is not good for many things, including Tibet. Unless India is on the United Nations Security Council, things are not going to be very even-handed in the global politics, whether Tibet or any other case. But having said that, Dr. Topgyal's point of view, it's not a question of suspicion on the Tibetan inside or outside. Not a question of being suspicion. If some Tibetans are very honestly for the Communist Party of China, reality, it's a political reality. Whether I suspect or not a suspect is not a question. I have to deal with that reality, and I don't have any other source to end that he is not sincere with the Chinese. This is the way that politics works. A personal suspicion or something like that, a political, but that's a very complex issue. We need discussion for that kind of subject. Dorji has this, this in the 80s, a lot of discussion took place with regards to the Brahmaputra water.
Ambassador Stobdan, unfortunately, you're breaking up again.
Oh, is it
Please
okay
continue.
now?
I think it's fine. Yeah, please continue, sir.
Yeah.
I think you've got it back.
Brahmaputra water is polluted with a lot of nuclear substance and all that kind of thing. Since then, going on. But, neither or India is a member of the signatory to the International Water Treaty. So we can't bring about the Tsangpo. But on top of that, some of the Indian leaders also come out that most of the water of Arunachal Pradesh or the Tsangpo River is within Arunachal Pradesh territory. Which the Chinese are trying to do to the Chinese side. That's the not the water which is there on the territory. So protocol, there is a memorandum of understanding to water data, seasonal water in the flood seasons to Bangladesh, not Bangladesh, but specifically to India. But goodwill treaty. In between, the data has stopped coming to Delhi, during the tension in Doklam or in Galwan. But the Chinese have resumed supplying that data to the Indian side. So far it's that, but point is that India is also upper riparian country. Indus flows to Pakistan, and a lot of noise when it comes to Indus, which has a lot of problem. So I think this is a very tricky issue. I don't think there's a war in the coming future. Countries are careful about this. It's linked with the global climate change and other issues. So it's a wider subject. I don't think it's a very, very clear-cut case for the Tibetan cause as such. People do talk about the water issue, but it doesn't add substance to the Tibetan movement as such. With regards to future of Tibet, I think I have a lot of hopes from the Tibetan youth. They're changing. People of, the youth of Tibet are changing, both inside China, inside Tibet and outside Tibet also. Youth, I do look at some of the social media and other, I have no other way of understanding the Tibetan politics, but sometimes people do have a lot of different ideas about Tibet. And I think if this generation has kept the issue alive, I think let's leave something for the future generation to take it forward. After all, I think we don't know. End of the day, we are all dead. So we don't know. So I won't see that Tibet, say after, if I go away, say in the next 20 years, I will not see how the Tibet is going to be shaped. But clearly, I think the best thing has happened is that His Holiness has kept the issue alive for so many decades and gracefully and dignified way. That's something which has to be appreciated. And a lot of international communities, to some extent, even India has contributed a lot. People are now talking about conferring Bharat Ratna to His Holiness. How this will be materialized, I don't know. But the fact that a lot of people are thinking about it, it adds to the Tibetan movement. It adds to them, not so much to His Holiness. The Dalai Lama doesn't require a degree or some certificate from some government. He's very close to Lord Buddha. So he doesn't require the certificate, but the fact remains that it adds to the Tibetan movement. That's very important. I like that thing. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Ambassador Stobdan. And it's indeed apt that you finished on a note of hope. And in fact, one can only hope that the current generation of Chinese leaders who have shown that they can pursue enlightened economic policies and who aspire to make China a respected global and regional stakeholder, they recognize that the resumption of a serious and direct dialogue with the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan community in exile offers the best hope for resolving long-standing problems and achieving worthy goals in Tibet. And for you and I, it is most important that we keep Tibet alive through debates and discussions, as an issue of such importance cannot be allowed to fade away from a collective consciousness. On that note, Dr. Michael Dillon, Dr. Shering Tobgyal, Ambassador Phunchok Stobdan, and Dr. Tenzing Dorji, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us in this discussion. We have been most enlightened with your opinions and your insights over the course of the last 90 minutes. Your presence and your opinions both are greatly appreciated. Thank you once again, gentlemen, for joining us in this discussion this evening. And with that, that's a program. Thank you, sir. With that, that's a program, ladies and gentlemen. Argumentative Indians is India's fastest growing thought platform, and I am Bhuvan Apurva Jha. For more of our such presentations and engaging discussions, subscribe to our official YouTube channel, or head over to our website, www.argumentativeIndians.com. And if you want to reach out to us, our email is in the description box below. With that, thank you so much for listening in. Tashi Delek,